down. And I'm really pleased to have you all here on stage. And we had a very interesting discussion in advance. And I would like to start with Gregor to introduce you. We are here in the automotive fair. BMW is well known in Germany. What was the situation behind building Startup Garage? It started 2006 with BMW I, the new idea, which was with a new model, electric cars. And then in this process, there was a new thinking about how to deal with startups. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, hi. Good morning. Great to be here. Well, I joined BMW in 2012, and the thinking behind that was that we needed to add some new ways of innovating, some new innovation methods. And one of the main themes here was being user-focused, not just come from technology and then build something, but also very much user-focused. And I spent, before BMW, about 12 years in the startup world. So the first thing I did at BMW is to get to know BMW, set up an internal innovation team, but then I also saw the opportunity of working more and more with startups. At that time, we already had collaborated with startups for over 20 years. So some of the most interesting innovations at BMW, for example, the iDrive, which you might know comes from a startup company, which we started working with in 1998, so over 20 years ago. And so after a few years, in about 2014, I started the BMW Startup Barrage because I saw there was a huge opportunity to leverage that new source of innovation for BMW, both a user-focused and also technology-focused innovation.
You say it's going back to the 90s, but it's an interesting story with Mobileye, which was close to BMW right at the start. Can you tell this story?
Yeah. Well, Mobileye is one of the startups that showed BMW that at the end of the day, we work with startups because they have something nobody has. They have such a good technology, they have such a good idea process, that we need to work with that startup for the startup to help us as opposed to we, the startup. And Mobileye was a company that approached, that we started to work with in 2002. So over 15 years ago, when they just had $1 million in funding and about 10 employees. And what we did back then is that we were looking for obviously a solution to make our cameras and our sensors better in kind of like the quest for autonomous driving. And we just basically, we compared the software and the solution from Mobileye, we put it into our cars next to the solution from Bosch and VDO Siemens, and we just measured the results, and we saw that Mobileye was significantly better. Why was it better? Because at that point, they already had applied machine learning and artificial intelligence to their software. That's about 15 years ago, mind you. And then our engineers said, well, we need to work with Mobileye, even though there are just 10 guys with $1 million funding, and we decided to work with Mobileye against a Bosch or some of the tier 1 suppliers, which have, in the neighborhood of 20,000, 30,000 engineers.
Yeah, interesting story. You raised up a little Israeli company, which is now worth 15 billion, as we all learned this year. So you are still working with them, or the whole company is. So this is an ongoing story. And not a disrupting story was with somebody I met on Monday, aside of the fair. It was Carsten Breitfeld, who was famous in BMW and the whole industry for building drivetrains for BMW, being the chief of it. He was the father of the BMW i8, and then he left. And everybody say, oh, what's going on here? And then suddenly he showed up in China, building a startup which is called Future Mobility Corporation. I met him on Monday. They are showcasing their first car. They have launched their brand last week. And for me, the interesting story is there are 2 or 3 topics. The first is they won't be faster than 2019 to have their first electric car. So they will be in the midst of the mass starting to fight Tesla. They are not faster. The second one, he told me a very interesting story that he met Paul Picard, the guy who flew with solar panels around the world. And this guy told him, I went to Boeing, I went to Airbus, I went to everybody in the business, in the industry, And everybody tried to convince me that it was not technical possible. And then he left to build his own team, and the effect was he didn't tell them that it wasn't impossible, so they made it possible. And this is maybe the idea of disrupting a well-situated industry. The second thing is what's going on in China. This is interesting for me. Is it the whole country one startup incubator? So Joseph, Constanty, please tell us what's going on, what is going on with your company.
Wow, I'll try to unpack that one. I represent New Technologies. We're the largest smart scooter company now in the world. We launched about 2 years ago from Beijing. And put something in perspective for you, the scooter industry, the two-wheelers, so Vespas, basically with an electric engine, sell about 26 million units a year in China. So population, 1.4 billion people, 26 million units a year are selling. We look at Europe, a two-wheeling continent. Guess how many electric scooters were sold in 2016? This includes B2B, less than 10,000 units. Greater Europe has a population of 800 million people. So what's happening in China, at least in the space of electric mobility, two wheels, is really leading the way of what is about to happen globally. And so where we stepped into this business about 2 years is to create a connected scooter. We work with Bosch for our motors, we work with Panasonic for our batteries. All of our units are connected using Vodafone or China Mobile globally. And what's interesting is in 2 years we went from nothing to about 335,000 scooters now on the roads of China, and just less than 4,000 on the roads of Europe right now, okay? So when you look at China as an incubation hub or a startup capital, as a whole, it's obvious that there has a massive market that makes it easier for startups to kind of scale very, very quickly. India, the same. The interesting part for us is we entered a market that was already very, very saturated. And where we were able to differentiate and how we came to market very quickly was 2 ways. We decided to sell all of our scooters online. So every single scooter was purchased in a flash sale through Jingdong.com, JD.com, second largest e-commerce player in China. And then after that, we began to roll out our flagship stores, and there's now about 400 flagship stores across China selling these units.
In how far are you dealing with your data? Are you earning money with it? What are you doing with it?
Everyone asks us this. Currently, what we use the data for that we're collecting is actually to improve the rider experience. We're not using the data to sell to marketing companies or anything along those lines. Everything is being used in-house to improve the performance, actually to improve our suppliers as well. We work directly with Bosch, we work directly with Panasonic to make sure that what they're creating as a supplier actually meets the needs of a two-wheel vehicle.
Okay, so data is maybe the topic, the keyword to switch over to India. Anurag, please tell us how you build up Sofy and what's the idea of coming to Europe.
So essentially, we are a carpooling company, and we connect people to share their trip together. But if you look at the bigger picture, what we are trying to do is we are trying to form an ecosystem where every player in the transportation sector, including the automotive companies, the navigation companies, or the OEM or the service providers, come in to form an ecosystem. And that's something which we are building. So Sofy is essentially a carpooling as a service company. And we started off from India in late 2015. And we facilitated more than 2.7 million successful trips in the last 22 months. The critical aspect of this success for us has been to understand how the whole ecosystem works. I mean, why would someone share? In India, a vehicle or an automotive or a car is not just a commodity, but it's a mark of respect. It's a mark of how successful you are in your society. I mean, the brand and the length of the car in the Indian society determines how successful you are. So it was more of a cultural thing that we had to handle. So we looked at the behavioral aspects of the whole consumer space. We looked at why would people share. I mean, we are talking about sharing economy for so many years, but we haven't seen a very cohesive or a very clear-cut leader in the space, right? So we have car-sharing companies, we have ride-sharing companies, we have multiple companies which are talking about multimodality, but there has to be some commonality between that, connects all these dots together to create a larger picture. And that's what Sofy is all about. And
is it easier to come to Europe? Do you have the same cultural questions, or how is it different?
Well, it was actually very surprising for us, even though India and Europe as a whole are two different ends of a scale. However, the critical factor or the most common thing here is the human behavioral factor. I mean, we as humans, we behave the same when we travel. Even in India, as soon as the plane lands, everyone gets up from the seat. That's also true here in Europe as well, right? So it's the behavioral aspect that we have to look into. I mean, why would a person who has invested, let's say, 15,000 euros or maybe 20,000 euros in buying a car will share that with someone who he or she doesn't know? We waste more than 135 hours every year being stuck in traffic doing nothing. Experience is something which people are talking about. Experience is something which people need when they're commuting from their home to office and office to home. And that is something what we are solving with Sofy.
Okay. I learned that you were brought to Europe by Tanja Kufner from Startup Bootcamp. This is an interesting story. Do you think that you are the mother of many startups? How do you deal with them?
It's a funny thing. I raised 2 children, and they're both adult and they're grown. So now I
It's
need
nearly the same.
37 more, and that's actually what I've done. I've got 37 new babies. Yeah, so what we do at Startup Bootcamp, we're a global accelerator. We focus on vertical industries, and my program is mobility. So it's interesting because we take many different corporate investors, bring them together, and help them kind of scope and scout for innovation for technologies around the world. And it's kind of defined by what they're looking for, right? So in insurance tech, insurance is an industry that needs to be just as disrupted as the automotive industry. And there we work with 19 competing insurance companies. We scout startups, and then we work with these startups to pilot. So in my vertical in Berlin, in automotive mobility, it's the same. So companies like Mercedes-Benz or Kuehne & Nagel and Cisco and here and many other corporates basically ask me to go and scout the planet for some of the most interesting startups. And then that's my job, is we build a huge database. Tanja gets on a plane. She travels for 2 months, goes to 20 cities, and meets crazy entrepreneurs. So I'll have met like 200 in the course of 2 months. And then obviously there's many places like India where I don't necessarily go to. And then we host another 60 or 70 Skype calls. And it was one of those funny days. I remember sitting in my kitchen with my scout speaking to Anurag. And once in a while, I'm a former investor, so I tend to invest in team, right? People always say, what's most important? I say team, and then team, and then team. But with Anurag on Skype, we knew within 5 minutes that this guy, he's a little unicorn. He's got a business model that's flying in India. I really would love to see him come to Berlin. I think we should invite him. And I knew that he would get selected, right? And then the question is this a great idea? You've got a business that is thriving in India, right? As a VC, I'd say go scale Asia, right? Why come to Europe? We could try to launch this in Europe and test it, which is what we did. And so far, so good. Anurag's now based in Paris and just closed a nice little round of financing, so we're proud. Yeah.
So we are coming back if it was a good idea to go to Paris or not, but discussing disruption from different angles. As a startup bootcamp is a different angle than Larry, yours at GE. You're like a multi-continent company. Tell us a little bit about innovating in this giant.
Well, certainly GE is, as a large company, we have established businesses, and within the businesses, they operate very much to the quarterly and annual rigor that the street expects from them. And so we set up an organization that is separate our GE Ventures, that allows us to do innovation, essentially that we're driving ahead, separate from the quarterly business units. However, we did things, I think, a little bit differently than other companies have, in that under Ventures, we have several different entities that allow us to really innovate and really address the need for commercial velocity, which we think is very critical. So we have a traditional corporate venture capital where we invest around energy and advanced manufacturing, around healthcare and digital. But we also have the ability within that activity to also incubate those companies and help grow and give them access to GE. And potentially it could be ones that could end up being either acquired or spun out on their own. But the idea is that these companies, any of which might get directly acquired within GE, would be probably swallowed by just the quarterly rhythm that's needed in order to achieve the typical financial metrics. But in addition to this corporate venture capital organization, we have the unit that I represent is under the licensing. So we have our licensing and technology ventures, where we do analyze the intellectual property for GE. We have over 100,000 global patents and applications. And we look at ways to do partnerships. We do pools, we even do dispositions of IP into startups. We do joint ventures. We do some acquisitions as well to supplement what's in the businesses. But by co-locating the licensing team with the ventures team, it allows us to do things differently than I think other companies have done. We've done investments where then we also do license deals and co-development with them as well. And then we also have a team within the organization, the third arm, which is around our new business creation, where we do both spin-ins as well, where you take a separate unit, maybe cutting across what were existing business units and generate a new business unit due to market changes that are going on. So that was for example, our current business that was formed. And we do spin-outs as well. So typically taking technology out of our research center and then spin them out into the world. And this is one where those spin-outs can also be ones that we could potentially be supplying back to GE as well. And we also ultimately can use that to take out maybe less successful businesses. An example is that we were making batteries within GE. It wasn't something that it turned out that we were greatly successful at, but we took that, we created a joint venture with a Chinese company, Chaowei, and now we're looking at them spinning it up. It was well within their core capability, and ultimately we could be a great consumer of their product as well as many others that they could sell to. So those three different arms we see as a way to really address the need to keep our pulse on new technology and keep it running separate from our business units.
Yeah. So Gregor, is it evolution or disruption we are right in? I learned it's all a question of speed. Is the car industry fast enough to adapt to new technologies? How do you manage? I learned that you changed it's not the big company and the small startup, but it was more like how can startups help big companies? So it's a shift of focus. Your work at Startup Garage, how does it work with a technology company which is quite sure we are the best in the world?
Okay. Well, I would think out of, let's say, there's about 1-point-something million startups out in the world. Out of those, about 100,000 get venture capital funded. Out of those 100,000, I don't have the academic statistic, but I would think that somewhere around 90, 95%, 99% are not disruptive. What they do is they bring technology, they bring a solution to their clients that we're currently missing, correct? And if you're a startup in the B2B world, then there's tons of startups out there that have great technology, like startups in the battery world, startups in the sensor world, startups in the software world, that have something that a GE may not have, that we may not have in our ecosystem, both internally and externally. And so the amount of startups that actually come to a corporate with a technology or a solution that we don't have, and they benefit from working with us, and we benefit from working with them because they help us solve problems faster, or they actually help us solve problems at all, right? Because we couldn't solve those problems without them, is so much bigger than the number of startups that are a disruptive threat. So I think as a corporate, what you need to do definitely is don't look at the startup world just as a threat, but take the 95% of startups that actually are a help to advance in your innovation faster and speedier. And that I call, that's kind of like the bottom-up innovation, correct? We at BMW have decided that we want to build autonomous driving. And within the autonomous driving challenge, as a big innovation, there are many hundreds of technology challenges, and some of those are just extremely hard to solve and not solved, and we're working with startups who out of the batch, get 36 million in funding. Because they have an IP, technology, IP, correct, patents, that nobody else has, and they have a team behind that nobody else has either. And we need to work with those guys, and we need to set up an infrastructure to be able to work with them extremely efficiently. Now then there is a top-down thing, correct? When out of those few startups, out of those few startups, there's maybe let's say a Tesla, correct? That's, disrupting, or an Uber that's somehow disrupting. And obviously also need ways of working with them, but that's more of a top-down approach that needs to come more from the kind of the C-level, where you may go into joint ventures, into acquisitions. That's a different model, it's a different process. You need both. But I would welcome if more corporates would also approach kind of the bottom up and see startups as an opportunity, because then we would create much more demand for startups. Startups would get clients much earlier in their life cycle, and the client is the best feedback that they can get, correct? It's not a mentor, it's the client, it's the engineer at BMW who sits with a guy who just got 36 million in his first round, who's building a technology, he says, will revolutionize automotive driver. And he definitely has something extremely good, because if not, nobody would give him 36 million, because to get 36 million is extremely hard in the first round. But he learns a lot from our engineers. He says, does your sensor do this and that? Does it work out of those and those? Those are the requirements that he wouldn't have in that detail. And to get that feedback in the first year of a startup is much more important than to get that feedback in the 5th year of startup. So what we did at the BMW Startup Garage, we said we want to be a client of a startup, because it's ultimately what makes a startup successful, but we want to be a client at a point where it's extremely risky to be a client. That's why we call it venture client. So we invite a startup to become a supplier of BMW, we become the client, we give them a purchase order, but we buy something that's not out in the market, that doesn't even have a price, that's not validated, that's not certified. And we then use that technology, and the startup works with a business unit. They don't work with me. They don't sit in an incubator or accelerator. They work directly with a business unit. They sit down with the guy who does the autonomous cars. They sit down with the guy who does the 3D printing in our factories. They sit down with the guy who does whatever, revolutionary HR systems, doesn't matter. And they work with that internal client, and they get paid for that, always paid. Always a purchase order, always a supplier number, always a pay. And that revenue is extremely important. And now what we do is we build on the great work of Tanja, because obviously the accelerators do an excellent job in converting an idea, a team of people, into a company, in setting up those first initial steps. That's extremely hard, because those guys have to pick out of the +1 million guys, the 100,000 that are actually, have something that's really of value. And then we build on that work. And then from here on, we give them a purchase order, but really, really early on. And in the past, I think most corporates, they start to work with startups when they're already in the growth stage. They have a product, it's proven, there's a price, but they don't have a system where they can actually sit down. For example, we just started a project with a company that's in the LiDAR space. A LiDAR has to be, that big. They have a LiDAR that may be that big in maybe 6 years. But we give them a purchase order, and the sensor they're giving us now is probably as big as a stage, right? But that's great for us, because now we get to see that sensor, even though it's huge, and probably would cost millions per unit, which is obviously something unfeasible. And we start to build a relationship with those guys on the same level or even beyond, because as we say that startups do something better than everybody else in the market, we have to treat them better. Correct? We have to give them more money. We have to we have to be, nicer. We have to. So it's because they are the market leaders at the end of the day. They're the guys who make advance the world, and that collaboration just works if you set up some of those systems a little bit different.
How many clients do you have right now? How many startups are there as
Okay, we decided not to publish anything about the startups we work with. Because they are part of a real innovation project, and it's a one-product company, correct? If we tell what startups we work with, we reveal the innovations we work on, correct? If you say that we work with GE has whatever, 1 million products, and that's okay, because nobody really knows what product we're working on. But if we work with a startup, one product company, we don't disclose that.
As long as you're working with them, it's exclusive for BMW.
There's no exclusivity whatsoever. If you as a corporate approach a startup with an exclusivity rule, you automatically just get the bad startups. You automatically get the startups that you do not want. Because the guy who gets funded 36 million, the guy who gets picked by Tanja, and Tanja will make sure to tell that guy, if BMW approaches you and wants exclusivity, say no. Because obviously in the venture business, what you need to do, you need to scale, you need an exit, you need to work with many clients. So what we build on is on being the first client. We want to be the early adopter. And if you are the first client of a startup, you get privileges. You get to know the founders. You get to work with the CEO. You build a relationship of trust. And obviously, you have a time to market advantage, correct? Because you are there before your competition. And if you work with a startup early stage, guess what? They will always customize their technology to your product as opposed to that of your competition. And you will get price preferences. So you don't really need those exclusivity, and because it scares away the good ones, and you just end up with the bad ones, correct? And that's something extreme. And our startups can obviously work in parallel with all our competitors. The only contract at this point we signed with a startup is an NDA, nothing else. And that reduces our time to, let's say, purchase, from touch point of startup to actually issuing a purchase order for that technology by somewhere around 12 to 18 months.
Yeah. That's
time that we save right there.
Tanja, you're nodding all the time.
I keep nodding because I love the approach of BMW Garage, because it's the only way to approach it, right? IP NDA, fine, maybe, but no. The interesting thing is the purchase order, right? So the startups that we bring into our program, they're selected with the value proposition that many corporates want to work with Sofy, right? So when we selected Sofy, it was Kuno Naga that said, we have this great idea. It was like 3 or 4 corporates, right? And part of my pain with these 37 babies that I have is that these corporates are so slow. And part of, if they work with us for 3 years, we teach them things, right? We hope to teach them a lot more on innovation than just bringing them products, because it's procurement, right? You need to, as a corporate, if you want to work with startups, you have to be different on so many processes. You have to sideline a lot of stuff. The legal department cannot get involved, because if they get involved and set up an IP NDA that will take 37 pages and basically kill the startup, that's not going to work, right? So a lot of these things, they're learning, they're adapting. So by working with multiple corporates and multiple startups, they're learning from each other, and sometimes it's beautiful. So many of my teams can go to demo day and say, turning away term sheets, I don't need 100,000 or 2 million or 5 million, because they're generating close to 1 million in revenues from just one of the corporate partners. The lucky ones have paid pilots with 2 or 3 or even 4 of the companies that are partnered in our program. And then there are other ones that really struggle, that are still waiting to make something happen, because it's just a very, very slow, huge organization.
You're going to change your business model a little bit, you told us in advance. So can you proceed on that?
The business model for me, or for the startup?
As startup bootcamps?
Yeah, so it's an interesting model. So innovation is everywhere, right? There's so many startup ecosystems. So you take London, you take, for example, FinTech. FinTech in London, there are, 60 FinTech programs in London now. So what we're learning is that a lot of mature markets, maybe the model of bringing early stage startups, which we do, which you appreciate, that then go to Garage or go elsewhere. It's an interesting model, but my model is now broken for me. So I had a 3-year fund, and every MD goes through this, the FinTech colleagues in London as well. And I think what we have to think about now is, we used to be a beautiful place for early stage founders to go because there's program, there's content. We do so many things. We hire entrepreneurs and residents to support these startups. But in reality, we're also helping corporates innovate. So bringing those two together, you're kind of on clashing opposites, right? So my job is to make sure that Anurag succeeds. At the same time, if the corporates aren't willing to innovate quick enough, I'm not doing him a favor by bringing him to Europe and, nothing moving forward. So I think the way it has to change for my model is if you really want to do a paid pilot with Airbus Space and Defense, you're not going to be a startup that is super early and that has given me 6% equity for 15,000 euros, right? That there's a huge mismatch. So from a corporate perspective, they want startups that are like the unicorns, right? That maybe have already found product market fit, are the mobile eyes of the world, or maybe not that far advanced, but at least are still not trying to figure out what they're building, but actually have traction, revenues, because that's when they're useful for many of the corporates. Yeah. Not all. I mean, obviously with BMW, we have, a different scenario, which is great, because then you find them at a stage where they're still early enough that you can mold them into building a product specifically for BMW, like Gregor just said.
So there's always the question of speed, of mobility in the companies. Joseph, tell me, how do you finance new? How is the Chinese startup culture?
Well, in China, there is access to capital. There's an abundant amount of capital in China. NIO has now raised just north of $70 million in a Series A fund, a Series A round, sorry. So getting access to money is not a problem in China. You have, the interesting part about our space, or you look at the mobile phone space, is what's happening in China is you have the access to capital, you have the largest single market in the world for whether it's a mobile phone or for a two-wheeler, you have all the suppliers, you have all the assembly plants, and you have brands being built. So I may be saying something a little bold here, but if you look at what's happened in the mobile phone space over the past decade, and then you begin to kind of carbon copy that to what's happening in mobility, whether it's auto or two wheels, the future of mobility really should be coming from the largest single market in the world, China. I'm sitting in Germany saying this, but it's very true. I think German auto players and moto players need to be more cognizant of what's actually happening in China, and I know they are. But at the B2C level, the customer themselves have to begin to be aware of what's actually coming out of China. The most number of electric vehicles to be sold in the world, where? China. Both 4 wheels, 2 wheels, delivery, everything. Where are the most manufacturers of electric vehicles? China. Both 4 wheels, 2 wheels, and cargo. Right? And most people, when I give the number of 26 million electric units and 2 wheels being sold every year, they get dumbfounded. This can't possibly be happening in China. How is China the most green country technically in the world in terms of mobility? One, it's the biggest market, it has the most capital, and it has the entire supply chain right there ready for them to be able to instantly move. So we can go from 0 to 300,000+ vehicles in 2 years because we have the entire ecosystem ready for us. Where our European counterparts in our space, in two-wheel electric scooters, whether that's the small startups that are coming out of Germany or out of North Europe or elsewhere, fortunately or unfortunately, they don't have the scalability that China provides us. And then that allows us to be able to scale product, but also to improve product, and then build it at a world-class level. And that's where China has an incredible advantage right now. And so, obviously we take advantage of it. And India...
Anurag, are you a little bit jealous? Should you be not in Paris, but in Shanghai? Where's the boomtown for your business?
No, I think we are in the right market because, sustainability is one very key aspect of what we are trying to do here. We are not just connecting people, but we are also trying to make our cities, our world, a much more greener space. And I cannot think of a better place which has the right mix of, entrepreneurial mindset, being the leader in defining strategies or defining the rules, the Paris Agreement towards the sustainability, and of course a lot of money. And I would probably credit the Brexit thing for making this decision much more easier for us. But in terms of shared space, I mean, in our space, when people talk about carpooling or when people talk about shared mobility, they only think about BlaBlaCar, right? So, it's the world leader in the carpooling space, and but that's something which we want to actually break. In 2015, when we started in India, even BlaBlaCar launched it in India, and during those 2 years, it was a very tough competition and a very neck-to-neck sort of a competition between us and BlaBlaCar. Even though we were doing something which was a bit different from each other, they were focusing on long-distance trips, we were focusing on more short-distance urban commute. They did over 3 million trips, and they had hundreds and millions of funds, whereas we did over 2.7 million trips in just under 300,000 euros with a team of 4 people. So the idea is to adapt as per the market. I think for us, what's critical here is to look at how do we balance between sustainability, how do we balance between providing experience for people when they travel with, and how do we make ourselves visible or bring us to a speed or bring us to a level where people can not just relate carpooling and BlaBlaCar, but also carpooling and Sofy. You know what I mean? So yes, of course, China is a different world altogether, but I think India, we have a very, sort of a very good experience in, coming from a very chaotic market and a very price-sensitive market, and also a very culturally sensitive market. And I think that these are certain traits which I think the Chinese market as well as the Indian markets have in common. And I think that's one of the advantage that the companies coming in from these continents or these countries have. It's far more easier for us to adapt to a much more organized market, right? So, it's like, coming from a fully packed public transportation bus to sitting in probably, one of the most luxurious car here. And, so it just makes our lives easy.
So the fully organized market is now raising big competitors like Uber, is it? What do you see if you look 5 years in the future? Will we have like Airbnb? Will we have bigger platforms serving the whole mobility chain? This is what I learned is BMW afraid of, that there will be a platform technology cutting them away from their customers and managing all mobility in all kinds of, all ways. So is it what you expect we will have in 5 or 10 years?
I think the future for us is, so we look at the automotive industry, the navigation industry, or the OEMs as individual pearls. And what Sofy is trying to do is, Sofy is trying to become the string that attaches all these pearls together to make a beautiful necklace, right? I think what we are trying to create is we are trying to create a common ground or a platform where all these players can come and share the resources. See, when we talk about sharing economy, it's not just about sharing your car, or it's not just about sharing your apartment, or it's not just sharing your cost. But I think it's overall, it's about sharing the overall resources. I mean, when I drive my car, if I carpool with people, why can't I get a free parking space at, let's say, a parking space by Indigo or maybe, APCOA parking? If I'm driving my car, why can I get, discount on insurance products? Is there a way we can connect, insurance companies, OEM providers, or car manufacturers to become a transportation service industry, right? Yeah. So from individual industries, we are creating one large cohesive transportation industry. And I think that's the future going to be. Like Mr. Ford in one of his talks, he definitely mentioned, we all are talking about autonomous vehicles or electric vehicles, but a traffic jam with 1 million electric vehicles is still a traffic jam unless and until we don't fill those seats in those cars, right? So Sofy is all about sharing those resources, sharing information, sharing experiences.
Yeah, talking about this future, Larry, what do you think will be your customers? Will it be cities? Will it be car companies? What is an electric company? You're in the hometown of Edison, sorry. Sitting, locating, looking at the world 5 years ahead.
I think that's something that's going to be very interesting as that evolves. As you look at the discontinuities that are going on, you look at electrification, autonomy, and sharing. What is that going to have as an impact to overall infrastructure? So for us, I mean, GE, we generate about 1/3 of the world's power on our equipment. We're looking at electrification as a major trend, but it's bigger than just having cars moving around as portable energy storage, if you will, because there's also a major shift from our side, which is around the renewable generation. The fuel's free. Once the hardware gets to the point where it's cost parity, which it has, and there's enough energy storage, which it's becoming available, all of a sudden the dynamics on how you do charging and storage fundamentally change. So it looks like, as you go forward, that there's going to be, at people's homes, there's going to be energy storage. You see this coming from Mercedes, you see this from Tesla. That seems like that's going to happen. Certainly the growth of distributed energy generation is just going to continue to proliferate, not just in the first world, we're seeing it everywhere as we have activities in, with the hundreds of millions of people that are not connected to the grid. That's one of the next big opportunities, is get them connected. But they may never be connected to the traditional grid, but rather be to microgrids in this distributed generation. So when you bring it around to what does that look like from a system perspective, you have microgrids, you have local generation. About 80% of your charging still is at home with those type of local energy storage and energy generation. And you have maybe higher speed charging along the way, but also that the vehicles then become part of the grid as well in terms of push and pull of energy. There's an arbitrage there for the price of power over the course of a day and over time. And that the one thing that we're watching as well is the sharing economy. What does that do to the total number of vehicles? So what's the total infrastructure that's really needed? Some of the places we see, and for example, in these sharing vehicles, not the Ubers, but rather like the Pandy Auto in China, where over 50% utilization rates. What if they get up to 80% like they're aiming for? You're really going to sell, 10 times less cars? It really is a fundamental change in terms of what kind of infrastructure is going to be needed. So a couple of things, I mean, it's a very dynamic place. I think that's why we're keeping our hand into the venture world as well, because I think you have to see, we don't have a perfect crystal ball, and you have to see that innovation that's coming from many different areas.
Gregor, do you need, as a company, a corporate vision of the future to see where to invest or where to partner? Is it more on the service side, or is it more on the technical hardware side, which I understand better than the soft side of it all? Do you need more to have this hardware company to be shifted to the software platform aspect?
Well, first of all, definitely. If you don't have a vision, you don't have an objective, you don't have a strategy, you don't know where to put your resources, you're toast. Right. So, that's the basis of running a company, be it a small one or a big company. At BMW we have a strategy. Let's call it strategy. We call it strategy unit. You can call it innovation unit, division, at each individual business unit. So there is obviously kind of a top-down strategy, correct? And for example, BMW started way over 10 years ago setting up a mobility division that was focused on, and that was our previous CEO, Mr. Rathor, who said we are a mobility company, and that was, mind you, over 10 years ago. He didn't say we are a car company, he said we are a premium mobility company, so that's very much part of the vision for over 10 years now at BMW. But more importantly is that is it hardware, is it software, is it this or that? Really, each business unit has expertise, and they need their own vision and their own strategy, and they need to have resources and tools to act on that. And that's why, for example, the BMW Startup Barrage, you can imagine a big corporate like BMW or like GE, imagine it's a village, it's a city, correct? We are 125,000 people at BMW. So imagine a town of 100,000 people. So what we need to do at the BMW Startup Garage, we need to know what are the needs and what is the vision of each of those individual citizens in that town, and have a very fast communication channel with those people, in order to know what they're looking for, what their problems are, and then make the matchmaking to the resource, innovation resource, which in our case is the startup company.
So you could never raise the amount of money to invest in all these companies. It's too big. There are too many different areas, too many topics.
Well, there's a myth around the whole investing thing. A corporate is not a bank. We sell products. We don't sell equity. So if you want to really have, and the investment in a company, if one company buys shares from another company, you're basically stepping out of your core competency if you're not a bank. And if you talk about venture investment, then you talk about the most risky type of investment you can do. There's no investment vehicle that's more risky than, and it doesn't matter if you're in, obviously it's still, and it's even extremely risky to invest even in grown-up, even in unicorns, and mind the risk of investing in a company that's still founded. So our core business is to make, to define and provide great mobility experiences. And our customers certainly do not care about how much equity we own from whatever startup. They care about how good are our products. And if we would approach each innovation of each of the thousands of startups we can potentially work with an investment approach, we would add about 2 years of time towards that collaboration. And by the way, it's not even needed, correct? Because at the end of the day, a startup says, I'd rather have $1 million revenue than $1 million funding. And every VC knows, and every startup knows, investment is sugar water, revenue is mother milk. Yeah. So let's not look at startup with the only tool to approach a startup is investment. It definitely is a tool, correct? It's a tool, but within the tool set, we think extremely powerful, especially when you talk about innovation, is purchase order. Just buy a product from that startup. You do not need to invest in order to work with a startup. And there's actually, we do some of this educational work within BMW. The other day I spoke to a business unit who said, well, can I work with a startup without BMW investing? Because we have an investment unit too, correct? Which is BMW iVentures. I said, no, you don't. We can work with it. If you think that the startup has great technology because you're the expert in 3D printing of plastics, let's go approach them. Let's define a pilot project. Let's give them XYZ for doing that project. Let's put them into our supplier pool. And let's start working with them and see if that works. And then if we decide that this technology needs to be owned by BMW, we need some kind of exclusivity, then we can go into the acquisition path or into the majority investment path, if that's really needed.
Tanja, let's talk a little bit about corporate Germany. You work with many partners here in the country. Which are the fast ones? It's the Mittelstand, which is quite important, even as a supplier base. I learned that they were ahead with the electromobility, but they, like Continental, they had problems to get their earnings back, so they lost millions. Where is the movement in Germany right now in venture capital, in partnering? What do you see in the landscape?
It's a great question. So I'm actually doing what every good startup should do. I'm eating my own dog food, we say. I'm doing my own customer discovery to see what are the different models of innovating. Because I totally agree with Gregor. Why invest, right, in a startup? Which is exactly what I talked about earlier, right? Our teams do this too. They don't need VC money for a while if the corporates understand to pay for pilots and trials. To get the corporates to get to that point, though, is very painful. And it takes years of practice. It took Kuno Nagel two programs to understand that. And the first time one of my AI startups said, okay, here's a paid pilot, here's an invoice for 20,000 euros, the CEO of Kuno Nagel flew to Berlin and insisted on spending a day with me. He's like, I don't understand. I'm spending so and so much, to be an investor in your program. Why do I now have to pay for the technology of the startup? Well, obviously, for obvious reasons, these are startups. They need to generate revenue, right? So it takes a long time. So there are many corporates. They have to go through innovation evolution journeys of their own, right? Startup Bootcamp tends to be a really great place for when a corporate is at the beginning of their innovation journey. And then they learn. They learn from the experience of doing pilots, not doing pilots, seeing many different types of technologies that they didn't think were interesting to them, and all of a sudden they're like, wow, I didn't even think I could do something with an autonomous drone company, but they're getting creative in thinking on being innovative themselves, right? Because they see a lot of different technologies. As they evolve, many do their own thing. Many raise their own corporate venture fund, right? So one of my clients from 3 years ago said, this was super, we learned a lot. We also learned we don't want to work with early stage startups. We're going to raise a 100 million fund. This was ENBV. So my experience has been the more the corporates do, the more interesting they are. The ones that do all kinds of stuff, the more they see, I think the more it helps them become a little bit more agile and lean and stuff like that. In terms of Mittelstand, I haven't had the luxury of working with a lot of Mittelständler yet, but I'm building a hypothesis. I would love to think that we can, in Germany, actually create an ecosystem where more OEMs collaborate on either a fund and also maybe with the Mittelstand. Now, I could be a dreamer because I keep evolving. I have hypotheses that I always want to challenge. Like 5 years ago, I would sit here and say to any startup, the biggest mistake you could ever do, your kiss of death is working with a corporate, right? And then I created a corporate accelerator, like she's crazy, because I wanted to prove that maybe actually working with a corporate is not so bad, right? And I think now the next thing I want to play with is, I think we only have one example in Germany where it's the company here, right, which we sold to BMW, Audi, and Mercedes-Benz. That was a startup I invested in called Gate 5 back in '99. I'm hoping maybe that there's something I can build that will actually get a lot of the OEMs and the Tier 1, the backbone of the German automotive industry, to collaborate on something, whether that's a big fund, whether that's a multitude of different things. If you kind of take maybe a systems integrator that's already, if you're looking at deep tech, it's going to be hardly, unless you're going to Gregor, it's impossible to actually get inside the IT system of a huge OEM unless you're already the IT company that's in the IT, right? So maybe there's different models of what I can build that gets more companies involved than just Mercedes only or Audi only. So I'd love to see what you think.
Let's see, Gregor, you're the next. If the last round, the last word, last famous words now. Let's talk a little bit about clash of cultures. So what is the biggest problem in your work in innovating, in changing processes? Where you see, what is your next goal to be faster? Gregor.
Okay. Well, firstly, investment, venture capital is the most expensive innovation tool you can acquire. It's the most expensive. Don't do it. There's good reason to invest in a company, but corporate venture capital is the most expensive innovation tool out there. Highly inefficient. The culture clash, there's no culture clash, nothing. We work with Microsoft, different culture. We work with Chinese company, big company, different culture. We work with Siemens, different culture. Pepsi-Cola is a different culture than Coca-Cola, and Unilever than Procter & Gamble. They're always different cultures. The reason we work with a startup is because they have something that we don't have, and that's a client-supplier relationship that's always out there. Doesn't matter. Don't use the culture difference as an excuse to, like, I'm not able to work with it because they have a ping pong and I don't have. Who cares? The startup doesn't care. The startup doesn't care whether you sit there in a suit or whether you don't sit in a suit. The startup cares about the purchase order. That's what he cares about, and we care about quality delivery, fast delivery, and so on. So culture is not an issue whatsoever because we have so many companies we work with that are huge, that are publicly traded, and that have a totally different culture. And maybe last word around the whole investment. You've before mentioned that there's a lot of venture capital out there. There's not a lot of venture capital out there. Venture capital is 150 billion a year that's going into startups. That's a fraction, a very, very tiny fraction of the capital markets. 150 billion on Wall Street is probably traded every half hour. Every half hour, and that's a number I'm just making up, correct? But there are trillions and trillions on a daily basis of shares being purchased from other companies by other investors and Wall Street. And in startups, the world capital markets invest 150 billion a year. Why don't we, change our mind and start saying, no, there's not enough capital, there's actually way too little capital, because if you raise, for example, a venture capital fund, and I'm sure Tanja knows a lot of story around, it's extremely difficult to go to a rich person, to go to a family office, to go to billionaires, to go to pension funds and say, give me money for my venture capital fund, because I'd rather take the money and stick it into, fixed assets, into bonds, correct, into real estate, so we need to change a little bit our discourse and say, no, there's not enough money for venture capital, there's not enough money for startups, because it's a tiny, tiny fraction. I would like maybe to sit down and make that number. What fraction of the capital markets actually goes into startup? And I'm sure we come down with somewhere around 0.0 something percent.
Okay.
But you just said that we shouldn't do it, but this is like my next
But no,
point.
I think there needs to be venture capital, definitely.
But this is
the good guys, a company is good in bringing out products and services, and we're good at the logistics and building that, and scalability, on investing in market research and whatever. Those are the good things. And you guys, the venture capitalists, the accelerators, independents, you're extremely good at finding the talent, at making companies out of that, make them grow. Those are two different competencies. And the corporate venture capitalists, if you go at a CVC at the end of the day, they say they are strategic and financial. Most of them are just financial with a strategic side benefit, and that's it. And if it's a pre-step towards acquisition, obviously that's a good thing to have, because maybe you need to have a stake first. But it's one of the tools you need to bring out. You need to have in your tool set. But the main tool set, the way to access innovation fastest, the most uncomplicated way is go to an early stage startup, see if they have a prototype, find the business unit within your company that can actually benefit from that, give them 5,000, give them 10,000, give them 50,000, give them 100,000 for a purchase order. Then you save, by the way, you just save 50,000 legal fees, correct? Because every investment takes at least 50,000 legal fees. I know from, and I could go talk forever, and I don't want to ruin that. We just have 2 minutes. But anyway, I think my point was clear. Thanks for.
Larry, will you, after Gregor's words, will you invest more or less? Will you partner more or less? What will be your strategy?
I understand his point, but I think actually I would broaden out the activity. I really do believe that the venture area is really maybe just focused too much around the money and should be more around the partnership. So that piece is correct, whether it be purchasing product or just looking at ways for technology infusion, which is another way that we engage, giving them the partners a way to leg up and move faster. I mean, we're very much around thinking about this commercial intensities, this time to market, and we work very much by working with our, whether it be investments or with our licensees or with our new businesses, is getting them into our supply chain and potentially into others. I agree 100%. Ultimately, it's about getting real revenue and not about ultimately just living off the corporate check. So I think that it's about building the partnerships more broadly and also setting the expectations within your company. So the part of the thing that has to happen with CVCs is that you really have to, it's that love-hate relationship. On one hand, people in the rest of the businesses say, why is that money going out of the company? That could help my bottom line. And yet you realize that you have to explain the story about how this is going to help their future, even though it does impact their quarterly P&L. So that relationship there, that financial versus strategic, has to be played out, and it's really the partnership that will enable you to do it. Pure CVC, I think it becomes tough. Most of them actually don't last a long time. If you look at the life cycle of a CVC, they tend to have a certain period of time, then they'll die off and they kind of get reincarnated. It's because you have to have that finishing game, if you will. You have to be able to put it in the back of the net, and part of that is to engage and get them ultimately to be suppliers or supplying into somebody, get them to market.
Anurag, what do you need, investors or partners?
My view is a bit different here.
Yes.
I mean, before starting Sofy, I definitely worked for at least 7 years in the corporate, in the banking industry, in capital markets. So I think we need more clarity in terms of how the corporates want us to engage with them. right? For us, time is critical. It's not just money, but what we need is faster decision making. That's something what my view is, and that is something which is still missing probably from that whole thing.
Because the platform thing is increasing so fast, the market share is shared so fast.
Not really. I mean, see, to bridge the gap, the corporates have created something called as innovation department, right? And they have appointed someone who's responsible to look at startups, get to the corporates and everything. But what they haven't given is the decision-making power. So in a way, unconsciously, they have creating one more layer for us to reach out to find the right decision makers in those companies. And that keeps our hope very high. And at the end of the 6 months, when that person is not able to find the right contact within the corporate, we go down. So,
yeah. Okay, Joseph, what do you need for Europe? Conquer Europe.
I think more startups and startup support. Really, I'll go back to China, and I hate to keep going back to it, but the speed at which you need to move is already happening in China. The access to capital that exists in China is far greater than actually is on the books. Okay, so the $185 billion level, maybe 2 or 3x that actually just circulating in China alone. The cultural divides that exist between big corporate and small startups is very apparent. I agree with you at some level. What you guys are doing at BMW is far different than most large corporations are, and it needs to be replicated and copied throughout the different industries. When that all comes together, then it's easier for everyone to work in this ecosystem. But right now, when you have single options that exist in the market, it's not a complete market for everyone to kind of collaborate and coexist in. If that makes sense.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we will meet faster soon than the next IIA, because the world is changing faster than every 2 years. So thank you very much for joining the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.